Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. We constantly hear about gross domestic product or GDP on the news. It's treated like the ultimate scoreboard for a country's success, right? The narrative is always when GDP goes up, the economy is booming and we're all doing better. But does a growing GDP actually reflect human happiness and well being? Or are we just, measuring the wrong things? Today, we're going to look at why treating national income as a perfect mirror for a standard of living is a really major mistake. We're going to systematically pull back 6 veils that completely obscure the truth about national income. These are 6 very specific, totally critical limitations that show exactly why a high GDP doesn't automatically equal a high quality of life. By the end of this explainer, I promise you'll be looking at economic headlines in a completely different way. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The illusion of GDP. 2. Distribution and output reality. 3. The cost of toxic growth. 4. Forced spending and shifting markets. 5. The uncounted joys of life. And 6. Seeing beyond the numbers. Section 1. The illusion of GDP, setting the baseline. So, first off, what actually is economic welfare? Basically, it's the total satisfaction we get from using goods and services that money can buy. Generally, economists use real per capita income, which is essentially just GDP divided by the population, adjusted for inflation, as a stand-in index for this welfare. The logic seems pretty straightforward, right? I mean, more goods and services available per person should technically mean a higher standard of living. But as we're about to see, this mathematical assumption is deeply, deeply flawed. Moving on to Section 2, Distribution and Output Reality. Lifting the first 2 veils. Now, what's really interesting about this is how income is distributed. Per capita income, it's literally just an average. It's a partial index. If a country's GDP skyrockets, but all that shiny new wealth gets captured by the very top earners while everyone else just stagnates, economic welfare hasn't genuinely increased for the average person. Actually, rising income inequality can actively reduce overall economic welfare, even if that big national income number looks absolutely fantastic on paper. You just can't judge a society's welfare without seeing how the pie is actually divided. And that builds perfectly into our second veil, the composition of output. Not all production is created equal. If GDP rises because a country mass produces capital goods, like, say, heavy factory equipment, that might help out future production, sure, but it does zero for current welfare today. Even crazier is the difference between civilian goods and non-civilian goods. If a nation ramps up production of guns and tanks, GDP shoots straight up. But a tank doesn't feed a family. Building military hardware inflates national income, but it completely fails to raise civilian living standards. Section 3. The cost of toxic growth. Unmasking the manner of increase. Listen, you can have a skyrocketing GDP that is utterly toxic to human welfare. Think about the actual manner of increase. If output goes up just because people are forced into grinding longer working hours, or if there's a sudden increase in child labor, welfare is actively being destroyed. And the exact same thing applies to the environment. Achieving high GDP through the ruthless exploitation of natural resources or by creating severe air and water pollution, it just plummets our actual lived experience. The economic output looks stellar on a spreadsheet, but the physical reality for the people breathing that polluted air, it's a drastically reduced quality of life. Let's look at Section 4. Forced spending and shifting markets, the traps of monetization. And this brilliantly illustrates the trap of what economists call regrettable necessities. They're expenses forced on consumers that add absolutely no joy to their lives, yet they magically boost GDP. For instance, if severe city pollution makes people sick and they're forced to spend thousands on medical treatment, well, that medical spending counts as GDP growth. No way, right? Or consider the forced spending on transport just to commute to a distant workplace. These expenses make the economy look bigger and way busier, but they merely manage the miseries of modern life without increasing any true welfare. Okay, our 5th veil is the monetization of goods and services. GDP only counts what is actually exchanged in the market for a price. If someone stitches clothes for their family at home, it's non-monetized, zero impact on GDP. But if that same family pays a tailor to stitch those exact same clothes, money changes hands, and boom, suddenly GDP increases. The actual physical amount of goods in the world is completely unchanged, yet simply because the transaction moved from the home to the market, national income grew. It's basically a math trick that falsely signals an increase in economic welfare when literally nothing materially improved. Section 5.
The uncounted joys of life, what GDP excludes.
So the crucial point here is what GDP entirely excludes, and it's massive. First off, leisure time. Shorter working hours and time to just relax make people immensely happy, but leisure is totally ignored by GDP. Second, non-market production. Like growing fresh vegetables in your own garden, it brings joy, it brings food, but it doesn't count. But most importantly, GDP completely ignores vital qualitative indicators, life expectancy, infant mortality rates, and adult literacy. A nation could realistically have a soaring GDP alongside terrible child mortality and low literacy, which just goes to show that these numbers simply do not capture human reality. Section 6. Seeing beyond the numbers, the reality behind the veils. When you look at economic data from now on, I want you to remember these veils. Remember that a rising tide does not always lift all boats, especially if that tide is polluted and leaves us with no leisure time to even enjoy it. If we measure the wrong things, we will inevitably seek the wrong goals as a society. We absolutely have to demand better metrics that capture the full picture of human progress. So, I'm going to leave you with this final question. If GDP isn't the ultimate measure of our well-being, what should we be measuring instead? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the numbers.